Imagine this, it's midnight, the year is 1364, and the wind howls like a hungry beast outside the stone walls of Caerphilly Castle. The torches flicker, shadows twist, and even the bravest knight shivers under furs that smell of smoke and sweat. The fire is dying. The stones are colder than death itself. And yet, this was considered luxury. The truth is, sleeping in a medieval castle during winter wasn't like drifting off in some royal dream. It was a nightly battle against the cold, the darkness, and sometimes, rats big enough to chew through your shoes. Castles weren't cozy retreats, they were fortresses, built for defense, not comfort. Their thick walls trapped the chill instead of warmth, and every gust of icy wind found its way through cracks and arrow slits. Even in the grandest chambers, a king might wake up to find frost glistening on his beard. Inside these massive stone fortresses, warmth was a luxury that only a blazing hearth could promise, but firewood was precious. Servants would haul it up from the lower courtyards, their breath freezing in the air as they stacked logs taller than themselves. Yet even a roaring fire could barely warm a few feet around it. The rest of the room, vast, echoing, and draped in damp tapestries, remained like a tomb. Noble families slept fully dressed, wrapped in layer after layer, wool, linen, fur. Some even wore gloves and hats to bed. Their beds were heavy wooden frames with straw or feather mattresses, stuffed so tight they crunched when you moved. But the real horror came at night, when rats crept through the rushes strewn on the floor, hunting crumbs or warmth. And then there were the drafts. Castles were full of tiny gaps where the stones didn't fit perfectly, letting in freezing air. Servants stuffed these holes with straw, rags, even animal hides, but it never really worked. On some nights, the temperature inside could drop so low that water froze in the pitcher by the bed. And imagine waking to see your own breath floating in the moonlight, realizing that even your thick fur cloak can't save you. Down in the servants' quarters, things were worse. No fire. No furs. Just straw, cold floors, and the smell of damp stone. Many slept in shifts, huddled together for warmth like animals. Some even shared the same bed, not from affection, but survival. The lower you were in rank, the closer you were to freezing. Yet even kings couldn't escape the misery. King Henry II once complained that his castle's draughts were fit to turn one's marrow to ice. At Edinburgh Castle, the wind howled so violently through the great hall that servants tied down the tapestries to stop them from flying off the walls. And in France, it's said that Queen Isabeau of Bavaria had her hair frozen to the pillow one winter morning. You might think, why not just build better chimneys? Well, chimneys were rare before the late Middle Ages. Most castles had open hearths where the smoke rose to the rafters, filling the hall with a choking haze before drifting out through a hole in the ceiling. The air was thick with ash, and everything, your clothes, your bed, your hair, smelled like burnt oak. People coughed through the night, eyes watering from the smoke. Still, they preferred that over the cold. And let's not forget the smells. Beneath the icy winds, the scent of humanity lingered, unwashed bodies, wet fur, moldy rushes. Chamber pots froze solid overnight and sometimes cracked. The stench in the morning was unbearable. Even the most elegant lady of the court had to endure it, smiling through chattering teeth. But perhaps the strangest part? People believed the cold was healthy. They thought chilly air purified the body and prevented disease. Some even left windows cracked open, letting the wind sweep through their chambers. Superstition ruled the night. Many feared closing themselves in would trap evil spirits inside. So they slept in cold, smoky rooms by choice. Still, humans adapt. Over time, medieval people developed clever ways to survive the endless winter nights. They used bed warmers, small metal pans filled with hot coals, slipped under the sheets before sleeping. But leave one in too long, and your bedding could burst into flames. There are records of entire bedrooms catching fire in royal castles, all because someone tried to get a little cozy. And then there were the dogs. Noble families kept bed dogs, small, furry companions bred for one purpose: warmth. They slept under blankets, curled by the master's feet, radiating heat like living embers. It wasn't unusual for a knight to share his bed with 2 or 3 of them. As the night dragged on, you'd hear the moaning wind outside, the creak of wooden beams, the distant drip of melting ice. Somewhere in the dark, a servant stirred the fire. Sparks leapt up, briefly illuminating stone walls blackened by centuries of smoke. Shadows danced. The fire whispered. And for a few moments, you might almost feel safe. But dawn was worse. The moment you threw back your blankets, the cold bit your skin like knives. You'd scramble to the hearth, hands trembling, breath fogging the air. Your boots were frozen stiff. Your water, solid ice. Even your armor, cold enough to blister your skin if you touched it barehanded. So why didn't they just build smaller, warmer houses? Because castles weren't homes. They were statements of power, symbols meant to intimidate enemies, not comfort their owners. The massive halls and towers were designed for defense and grandeur. Warmth was an afterthought. And yet, despite it all, the people who lived in them adapted. They laughed, feasted, sang songs under flickering torchlight. They told ghost stories about spirits wandering the battlements, about the howling wind carrying voices of the dead. In the heart of the coldest winter, surrounded by stone and shadows, they found ways to keep the darkness at bay. Because maybe, just maybe, it wasn't the fire that kept them alive. It was each other, the sound of voices, the promise of morning, the stubborn will to survive one more freezing night in a castle that was never meant to be a home. And as the fire faded, and the wind crept back in, history kept whispering the same truth. Sleeping in a medieval castle during winter, really, truly, sucked. The great hall might have been the heart of the castle, but the royal bedchamber, that was its soul. Every monarch, knight, and noble who ruled within those walls spent countless nights fighting not battles, but the bitter, invisible war against the cold. And if the great hall was a furnace of life and feasting, the royal bedchamber was the graveyard of warmth. The chamber of Lord Alaric of Dunmere Castle, for instance, stood 3 stories above the courtyard, a room so vast it echoed with its own silence. The walls were thick as a man's height, carved from rough granite that sweated with dampness. Even when the fire blazed, the stones exhaled cold. His bed stood near the hearth, massive oak, carved with lions and vines, covered with pelts from bear and wolf. But on most nights, even the furs felt like ice. Servants came before dusk to light the fire, their fingers numb as they fumbled with flint and tinder. The logs hissed and spat, smoke crawled upward, curling around the iron canopy that tried, and failed, to catch it. The flames danced, but their warmth barely reached halfway across the room. Alaric often lay awake, staring at the rafters lost in darkness. The fire crackled faintly, and the faint scent of burning resin mixed with something sour, damp wool, stale air, unwashed skin. The cold didn't just creep into his bones, it became a presence, something alive, whispering in his ear through the night. Sometimes, when the wind screamed through the arrow slits, he swore he could hear voices in it. Even the queen's chambers, richly adorned and heavily curtained, were no safer. Lady Isolde, his wife, slept under 3 feather quilts, her face wrapped in linen like a pilgrim. Her maid would heat bricks in the fire, then wrap them in cloth and slide them under the covers to warm her feet. But within an hour, the warmth faded. The bricks turned cold again, stone against flesh, a reminder that even luxury had limits. It was not uncommon for noblewomen to wake with frost forming on their lashes. The chill could make metal jewelry sting the skin, even the rings on their fingers could bite with cold. To combat this, some nobles wore gloves to bed, soft wool lined with fur, and pulled hoods over their heads like monks. But perhaps the most fascinating, and forgotten, invention of the medieval bedchamber was the curtained bed. The canopy and drapes weren't just for privacy, they were life-saving. Heavy curtains trapped what little heat existed, turning the bed into a small cocoon of breath and warmth. Within that shadowed tent, one could almost imagine the outside world didn't exist. Yet even inside, the air could feel thick, stale, and smoky. Some servants described the smell of their masters' beds as a stew of bodies, sweat, and candle wax. Candles themselves were both a comfort and a curse. They gave light, but they devoured oxygen. Too many, and you'd wake dizzy, your head pounding. Too few, and the dark would swallow the room whole. There were tales of nobles who slept with candles burning all night to ward off winter demons. One chronicler claimed that in 1387, a duchess in Burgundy set her bed alight when her candle toppled in the night. The servants found her alive but trembling, her canopy blackened with soot. To the medieval mind, sleep was never just rest, it was a spiritual act. People believed that evil spirits roamed in the cold, looking for bodies to enter while they slept. That's why they crossed themselves before lying down, or whispered Latin prayers to Saint Blaise, protector against winter illnesses. Many hung charms of iron or garlic near the bed, not for warmth, but protection from unseen things that crept between the hours. In Alaric's castle, the wind carried strange sounds, groaning timbers, distant footsteps, and sometimes the faint chiming of the chapel bell far below. But on one particular night, the cold grew so deep that even the stones seemed to hum with it. The fire sputtered, choking on its last breath of air. Alaric's eyelids fluttered. Outside, the moonlight touched the courtyard, turning the frost to silver. The guards huddled near the gatehouse, their cloaks stiff with ice. A horse whinnied, steam rising from its nostrils. The river beyond the walls had frozen solid, and the moat was a mirror of glass. Inside, Lady Isolde stirred, whispering a prayer for warmth that would never come. It was said that, during winters like this, breath itself became a curse. Moisture from the mouth turned to frost on pillows. Blankets froze at the edges where they touched the stone wall. More than one noble was found dead at dawn, not from sickness or sword, but from the quiet, patient embrace of cold. And yet, even through that cruelty, life continued. In the morning, servants would bring bowls of weak ale and porridge thick with lard. Alaric would rise, teeth chattering, and slip into a double-layered tunic stiff with frost. He would curse the winter, curse the stones, and curse the day he ever thought building a castle on a hill was a sign of power. Still, As he looked out the window, the world seemed pure, white snow on black battlements, the river gleaming like crystal. The suffering was part of the majesty. The pain was the price of privilege. That was the strange truth of the royal bedchamber. It was both throne and prison. A room built for kings, but ruled by winter. And the winter never slept. The castle may have been the Lord's fortress, but it was the servants who kept its heart beating, and froze for it. While nobles huddled under firs beside grand hearths, hundreds of unseen hands worked in silence below. They were the ones who stoked the fires, fetched the water, mended the tapestries, and hauled endless buckets of wood through corridors so cold they could hear their own breath echo against the stone. In winter, these servants became ghosts of the castle, moving in shadows, wrapped in rags that smelled of soot and sweat, their fingers cracked and bleeding from the chill. They slept little, ate less, and prayed not for gold or favor, but for a bit of warmth that lasted longer than a breath. The servants' quarters lay deep beneath the great hall, where the air never moved. Damp, black walls sweated constantly, and the smell of mildew mixed with smoke. The ceiling dripped from condensation, falling into puddles that froze overnight. Their beds were not feather or fur, but straw, laid on the stone floor, covered with old sacks or rough woolen blankets that barely held off the cold. A boy named Tomas was one of them. Barely 14, he worked as a scullion, lowest of the low. His day began before dawn, when the castle still slept. He rose in darkness, feet numb, and shuffled to the kitchens with a wooden bucket clanging at his side. His breath rose in the air like smoke. The kitchen hearth had gone out hours ago, and the ashes were cold. He struck flint until sparks caught. The moment the fire came alive, he held his hands over it, eyes half closed, feeling the heat bite his skin. That moment, those few seconds of warmth, was paradise. Then came the chores. He scrubbed pots, hauled water from the frozen well, and fed scraps to the dogs. The water from the bucket froze on the way back up the stairs. Once, when the rope snapped, he fell into the icy mud and spent the rest of the day trembling, teeth clattering so loud he could barely hear the cooks shouting. By mid-morning, he joined others in carrying logs up to the great chambers above. The climb was endless, spiral stairs slick with frost, torches burning low, the air thick with smoke. His hands blistered from the wood's rough bark. By the time he reached the top, his breath came in wheezes. He dropped the logs beside the hearth and waited. Sometimes, the Lord's steward would toss him a crust of bread for his trouble. More often, he was ignored. The castle's hierarchy was carved in stone, as unyielding as the walls. The nobles shivered in luxury, the servants froze in labor, and the invisible line between them never blurred. At night, when the nobles retired to their curtained beds, the servants gathered in the kitchens for what warmth remained. The massive ovens still radiated faint heat from the day's baking. They sat in a circle, men, women, children, sharing scraps of bread, boiled onions, and ale gone sour. The youngest huddled close to the old ones, who told stories to keep their minds from the cold. Tomas's favorite was the tale of the fire saint, a spirit said to visit loyal servants in their dreams, wrapping them in invisible warmth. "If you feel warm in your sleep," old Maggie the washerwoman would whisper, "don't wake. That's the saint's blanket. Let him keep you safe until dawn." But the saint didn't visit everyone. Some never woke at all. It happened quietly, like a sigh. One morning, they'd find a servant still and pale, eyes open but unfocused, straw frozen to their hair. The steward would order the body carried out to the chapel yard. No one spoke of it again. The others went on working. Even the animals weren't spared. The stables were bitter cold. The horses' breath steamed in the air, their manes crusted with frost. Stable hands slept beside them for warmth, their faces pressed to the horses' sides. Sometimes, the animals died standing up, frozen mid-breath. In the laundry rooms, the women's hands turned raw from scrubbing frozen linen in icy water. They sang as they worked, soft, haunting melodies that echoed through the stone halls. The songs weren't for beauty, they were to stay awake, to drown the silence, to remind themselves they were still alive. And above them, in the upper halls, life continued as though none of it existed. Lords dined beside fires that ate entire trees. Ladies played the lute with gloved fingers, complaining of the terrible chill. The cold had become a part of the castle's soul, shared unequally, but suffered by all. Sometimes, when Tomas carried the waste buckets through the corridors, he paused to stare at the flickering light spilling from the noble rooms. For a moment, he imagined what it must be like to sleep in a real bed, to feel fur against skin instead of sackcloth. He didn't envy their gold or crowns. Only their warmth. Yet, there was something unbreakable about these servants. They laughed, even when their teeth chattered. They shared their crumbs, their cloaks, their stories. They endured. For in a world where stone ruled and fire was fleeting, their spirit was the only thing that stayed warm. And so the castle breathed, its lords dreaming above, its servants shivering below, each dependent on the other, bound together by cold, duty, and the endless winter that neither could escape. Would you like me to continue with Part 4, The Castle at Midnight, where we follow what truly happens when everyone sleeps, the creaks, the whispers, and the haunting sounds that filled the ancient halls through the coldest hours of the night? That part becomes more atmospheric and eerie, like an immersive night experience perfect for your USA audience's sleepy historical videos. The Castle at Midnight. Midnight in a medieval castle was unlike midnight anywhere else. It was not merely the hour of darkness, it was a living thing, a slow pulse that moved through the stones, whispering in the cracks, sighing in the rafters. When the last candle guttered out in the great hall and the fires sank into quiet embers, the castle seemed to exhale. The world outside vanished into the black. The air grew heavy, the silence thick enough to hear the ticking of the heart. From the ramparts to the kitchens, every shadow took on a shape of its own. Lord Alaric of Dunmere lay in his great curtained bed, his breath clouding the air within that narrow space. The fire had died hours ago. Only a dull red glow lingered, barely enough to outline the carved lions at the foot of his bed. He turned in his sleep, pulling the furs tighter, but the cold had teeth, it found its way through every fold and seam. The wind began its slow, moaning rise, pressing against the shutters. The iron hinges creaked. Somewhere in the corridor, a door slammed open, then shut again, though no one was there. Below, in the servants' quarters, the silence was broken only by the low hum of snores and the occasional rustle of straw. Young Tomas stirred, half dreaming, half awake. The fire in the kitchen had gone out, leaving the air thick with smoke and frost. He pulled the ragged blanket over his head and listened. He could hear the castle itself breathing. A distant drip of water echoed in the well shaft. A chain rattled in the guardroom above. Far off, a horse stomped once in the stables, its hooves clattering against stone. The sound was followed by stillness so deep it felt sacred. Then came the sound that every castle dweller knew, the one that made blood run cold even in the heart of winter. The groaning. Not human, not animal. It was the sound of the stone itself, walls shifting, timbers settling, echoing through the halls like a voice from beneath the earth. In the dead of night, when firelight had gone and no torches burned, the castle came alive in its own ancient language. Some said it was the sound of the wind. Others said it was the ghosts of those who had built it, still wandering through its bones. Servants told stories of phantom footsteps in the western tower, of a knight who had frozen to death on guard and was doomed to walk his post forever, his armor clinking faintly in the corridors when the cold was sharpest. Tomas did not believe the tales, at least, not until that night. As he lay there, eyes open to the dark, he heard the faint scrape of metal against stone. A slow, dragging rhythm. Step, scrape. Step, scrape. It came from the hall above the kitchens. He held his breath. The sound stopped. Only the wind sighed through the cracks. Then it started again, closer this time. Step, scrape. He rose, heart hammering, and crept toward the stair. A sliver of moonlight filtered through a slit window, painting the stones silver. The air was so cold it burned his throat. He climbed halfway up, listening. The sound had vanished. Only the silence remained, heavy, absolute. He turned back toward the sleeping forms below. And that was when he saw it, a faint shimmer at the edge of sight, as if the air itself had frozen into a ghostly shape. A ripple of frost moved along the wall, leaving a trail of glittering crystals in its wake. Tomas stumbled backward, his breath catching in his chest. He told no one what he saw. The next morning, when the fire was lit again and the castle stirred with life, it was easier to believe it had been a dream, or a trick of moonlight on stone. But others had seen things too. A maid once swore that she saw a woman in white walking the battlements barefoot, her gown trailing frost. The guards said they heard voices calling from the frozen moat. Even Lord Alaric confessed to his confessor that he sometimes woke to the sound of whispers behind the walls, voices too low to understand, speaking in a tongue older than Latin. The truth was, castles kept their secrets well. The stones had seen war, death, oaths, and prayers. Every wall was a witness. And when winter came, and the world froze silent, the memories stirred. The castle at midnight was both sanctuary and tomb. The torches burned low, casting trembling halos on the walls. A single candle flickered in the chapel where a priest whispered his prayers to the Virgin, his breath fogging in the air. The wax dripped onto the altar, solidifying before it could fall. In the kitchens, Tomas slept again, clutching his blanket. He dreamed of warmth, of spring fields, of sun. In his dream, the walls melted away, and he walked barefoot through green grass. The cold could not reach him there. But the castle did not dream. It waited. As the night deepened, frost spread across the windows, sealing them in patterns like spiderwebs. The fire in the Lord's chamber died to ash. The guards stamped their feet on the ramparts, eyes half shut against the snow that began to fall silently over the valley. And through it all, the castle held its breath, an island of stone surrounded by an ocean of darkness. When dawn finally came, pale and weak, light crept through the slits like the first sigh of the living. The castle would stir again, fires would be lit, bread baked, bells rung. But for a few brief hours each night, when the world froze still, the castle belonged not to the living, but to time itself. And in that silent reign, it was truly eternal. When the fire dies. Fire. It was more than warmth, it was life itself. In a medieval winter, a castle without fire was a corpse made of stone. When the flames died, everything began to change. The air thickened. The walls seemed to move closer. Even sound froze. The laughter from the great hall, the clang of pots in the kitchen, the stamping of horses, all faded into the quiet rhythm of cold stone breathing. That was how it began at Dunmere Castle one terrible January, in the year of our Lord 1372. It was the coldest winter anyone could remember. The river had frozen solid, trapping the water wheels and cutting off the castle's mill. Snow buried the courtyards, the gates, even the stables. No carts could reach them. No wood could come up from the valley. The steward counted the firewood in the storehouse, 3 stacks left, each smaller than a coffin. Enough for 4 days, perhaps 5, if they burned sparingly. Lord Alaric ordered the hearths in the great hall and chapel to stay lit. The Lord must not freeze in his own house, he said, but every other fire was to be extinguished. The kitchens, the servants' quarters, the barracks, all went dark. The castle began to die by degrees. In the lower halls, the walls turned wet with condensation. Bread grew mold overnight. The servants' breath hung in the air like ghosts. Some tied cloth around their mouths to keep their teeth from aching in the cold. Upstairs, Lady Isolde's hands turned blue despite her furs. Her maids rubbed her skin with oil and wine to keep her blood moving. Still, her fingers swelled and cracked. When she reached out to touch her silver comb, it burned her skin like ice. The Lord's chamber fire was guarded like a holy relic. Servants took turns feeding it, one log at a time, watching each flame with the reverence of prayer. The wood hissed and popped, but even the fire seemed weary, as if it too were starving. By the 3rd night, the frost crept in. It began as a thin white edge along the window glass. By dawn, it spread across the walls in delicate veins, like a frozen ivy climbing toward the ceiling. The rushes on the floor stiffened. The curtains turned rigid where they brushed the walls. And the silence deepened. In the kitchens, Tomas and the other servants huddled beside the oven, now dark, cold, and blackened. He had never realized how loud fire was until it was gone. The absence of crackle, the stillness of air, the way sound seemed swallowed by the stone, it was unbearable. They wrapped themselves in old sacks and sat in a circle, sharing what heat their bodies could make. Maggie the washerwoman told them to think warm thoughts, to imagine sun on their faces, the smell of bread baking, the sound of bees in summer. It helped for a few moments. Then the cold returned, patient and merciless. That night, a guard was found dead at his post, frozen solid with his hands gripping his spear. His body was brought to the chapel, but even the candles there struggled to burn. The wax cracked, and the wick sputtered out in seconds. The priest said nothing. He only crossed himself and whispered, Ignus Dei, God's fire, do not forsake us. The next morning, the snow began to fall again, thick, heavy, silent. The roofs sagged under its weight. Icicles the length of swords hung from the parapets. Tomas was sent to fetch the last of the wood from the courtyard. His boots sank to his knees in snow. He could barely see the walls through the white haze. The logs were buried, frozen together like stone. He hacked at them with an axe until his hands bled. When he finally returned, dragging a single bundle, the steward took it wordlessly. He placed the logs in the Lord's fire, and the castle watched. The flame caught slowly, crawling like a wounded thing. Then, for one brief moment, the room glowed gold. Faces softened. Shoulders eased. The warmth spread through the air like a breath from heaven. But by morning, it was gone again. By the 5th day, there was no wood left. The fires went out one by one. The great hall grew dark. The chapel's candles froze to their holders. The sound of the wind through the towers was the only voice left. In desperation, servants began to burn anything they could find: broken stools, old barrels, straw from the stables, even the handles of tools. They ripped the doors off their hinges and fed them to the hearth. The flames licked them hungrily, devouring the castle's own bones. Still, it wasn't enough. The cold crept into the heart of the place like an invader. Stone by stone, breath by breath, the castle surrendered. People began sleeping in groups, huddled in corners, covering themselves with carpets torn from the walls. Tomas found a small ember one night, hidden deep in the ashes of the kitchen hearth. He cupped it in his hands, whispering a prayer as if it were a child. He placed it in a clay pot, fed it with straw, and blew gently until it glowed again. That faint orange spark lit his face, and something inside him. He carried it through the dark corridors, shielding it from the wind with his body. Up the stairs, past the silent tapestries, until he reached the Lord's chamber. He knelt by the dead hearth, tipped the ember into the ashes, and breathed. Once. Twice. And the flame came back. A small one, trembling like a heartbeat, but alive. When Lord Alaric woke, the first thing he saw was Tomas crouched beside the fire, his face pale, his hands blistered, his eyes glowing with the same light he had saved. For the first time in days, the Lord smiled. That single ember was carried to every hearth, every room, every corridor. Servants cupped it in pots and iron bowls, guarding it like treasure. One by one, the fires were reborn, their light spilling over the walls, chasing the shadows away. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, the castle lived again. When the fire dies, hope dies with it. But when it's reborn, even the coldest castle remembers how to breathe. The long thaw ****. The first sign of spring in a medieval castle did not come as birdsong or sunshine. It came as sound. A faint drip, somewhere deep within the walls. At first, no one noticed. The servants were too tired, too numb, still wrapped in layers of wool and silence. But then came another drip. And another. And soon, the steady rhythm of melting ice began echoing through the halls like a heartbeat returning after a long sleep. The frost that had sealed the windows began to weep. Drops trickled down the glass, leaving crooked trails through the white haze. The air changed, just slightly, no longer biting, but damp and heavy with the smell of thawing stone. Winter was dying. The fire in Lord Alaric's chamber no longer struggled, it burned bright, alive again. The logs hissed less, the smoke rose clean. When the morning light broke through the arrow slits, it carried dust instead of frost. For the first time in months, the cold retreated. Tomas woke to the sound of water dripping into a bucket. He lay still, eyes half open, not daring to believe it. The straw under his back felt softer somehow. The ache in his bones had dulled. His breath no longer hummed like smoke in the air. He rose and stepped outside into the courtyard. Snow still clung to the corners, but it was thinning. The air smelled of wet earth, of decay and life. Icicles fell from the ramparts, shattering like glass. The moat, once frozen solid, now cracked and groaned as the first trickles of water pushed through. And then came the birds. A single sparrow, small and brown, darted across the sky and landed on the wall. Its song was weak, uncertain, but it was music unlike anything the castle had heard for months. Servants paused in their work to listen. Some smiled. Others cried. Lady Isolde stood at her window, fingers pressed to the cold glass. Her breath fogged the pain as she watched the snow melting on the roofs. The gray sky seemed lighter now, softer at the edges. "It's over," she whispered to herself. "By God's mercy, it's over." The castle began to wake. The cooks lit the ovens again, not for warmth, but for bread. The smell drifted through the corridors, rich and warm, stirring memories of better days. Children ran in the courtyard, slipping in the slush, laughing for the first time since autumn. The dead were carried to the chapel for burial, the guard frozen at his post, the old washerwoman Maggie, who had fallen asleep beside the hearth and never woken. Bells tolled softly, not in grief, but in gratitude. For everyone who had perished, 10 had survived. Tomas helped dig the graves. His hands were blistered and raw, but when he pressed them into the wet soil, he felt warmth beneath it. The earth was breathing again. Lord Alaric stood on the ramparts, his cloak whipping in the thawing wind. Below him, the valley glimmered, patches of green showing through the snow like veins of life in the body of the land. Smoke rose from the village again, the peasants had returned to their fields. The river ran wild, carrying away the broken ice. He turned to Tomas, who stood beside him now, a boy no longer, but lean, hard, and quiet. "You saved us," Alaric said. Tomas shook his head. "It wasn't me, my lord. It was the fire." The Lord smiled faintly. "Aye. But the fire needed a hand to carry it." In that moment, neither spoke further. The wind carried the sound of bells from the valley, a low, steady toll that rolled across the hills. It sounded like prayer. The castle, once a tomb of frost, glowed again in the afternoon light. The stones gleamed wet and dark, alive. Smoke curled from every chimney, banners stirred on the towers, and the sound of hammering began as workers repaired what the cold had broken. Life returned not all at once, but in quiet layers. A cup of warm ale shared between friends. A song hummed by a servant in the kitchen. A child's laughter echoing through the hall. And yet, the winter had left its mark. There were cracks in the walls now, thin but deep. Some stones had split from the frost. The tapestries still smelled faintly of smoke and damp. But within those scars, there was something new, resilience. For those who had survived the winter knew that warmth, once lost, was not easily taken for granted again. As dusk fell, the sky turned the color of pale fire, orange fading to gold, then to violet. The first stars appeared above the towers. Tomas stood in the courtyard, watching his breath fade into the soft night. He held a small ember in a clay bowl, the same fire he had carried months before. He placed it gently into the hearth in the great hall. The flame caught. It danced, strong and sure, reflecting in every eye gathered there. And for the first time since autumn, laughter filled Dunmere Castle, not the nervous kind, not the hollow one born of fear, but a full, living sound that rose to the rafters and met the stars. The castle had endured. The fire had returned. And outside, the world began again. When the fire returned. The last night of winter was not the coldest. It was the quietest. The wind had gone still, as if even the air was holding its breath. Snow no longer fell. The stars, hidden for months, finally pierced through the clouds, faint, trembling, but real. They hung above the towers of Dunmere Castle like distant candles, watching. Inside, the fires burned low but steady. Servants slept beside them on the floor, too tired to speak. The hall smelled of wood smoke, tallow, and wet wool. Every stone of the castle seemed to sigh in relief, as if the walls themselves had survived the winter. Tomas sat alone in the great hall, staring into the fire. He could hear the soft breathing of the others, the guards, the cooks, the stable boys, all gathered in warmth for the first time in months. For so long, the flames had been the only living thing in the room. Now, it felt alive with hearts again. The embers cracked softly, sending up tiny sparks that danced in the air. He thought of every night spent shivering, every morning he had wondered if the cold would finally win. He thought of Maggie, who never woke. Of the guards who froze on duty. Of Lady Isolde's tears. And he thought of the silence that had followed them, a silence deeper than any grave. But that silence was gone now. Outside, under the melting snow, something stirred, the slow pulse of life returning to the land. A single drop of water fell from the ceiling. Then another. The thaw had begun. At dawn, Tomas opened the heavy oak door. The light that poured in was pale but golden, the first true sunlight of the year. It filled the hall, glowing through the smoke, painting the faces of the sleeping servants. He stepped outside. The world looked broken, yet somehow beautiful. Snow lay in patches, melting into dark rivers that ran down the stones. The air smelled like wet earth and smoke, the scent of things being born again. From the battlements, Lord Alaric watched the horizon. His cloak fluttered in the wind, and his breath no longer smoked in the air. He had seen many winters, but none like this. None that had cut so deep. "Look there," he said quietly. Tomas followed his gaze. In the valley below, thin wisps of smoke rose from the village, proof that the peasants had returned. They were lighting fires, cooking again, rebuilding. And beyond them, the frozen river groaned and split, the first current breaking free. It was not just the castle that had survived. It was the world itself. That night, the great hall was filled with warmth again, not just from the fire, but from life. The cooks brought out the last of the salted meat and baked fresh loaves of barley bread. Children laughed as they chased each other around the benches. Someone began to play a lute, its strings dusty from months of silence. And when Lady Isolde appeared in her winter cloak, her face lit by the fire, even the servants smiled. She looked older. Tired, but there was light in her eyes again. Lord Alaric raised a cup of ale. "To those who did not see the spring," he said. His voice trembled, but did not break. "To those who held the fire." Every cup lifted. For a moment, there was only the soft crackle of flames. Then came the sound of hundreds of voices, whispering together. To the fire. Tomas drank quietly, the warmth of the ale spreading through him like sunlight. He looked around the hall, at faces worn by hunger and hardship, but glowing now with life. He realized that what they had endured was not just a winter of weather, but a winter of the soul. And now, as the firelight flickered across the walls, he understood something new. Survival was not just about warmth. It was about each other. Outside, the snow melted faster. Water ran in streams through the courtyard, carrying away ash and soot. The stables filled with the sound of horses again, stamping their hooves impatiently for the open road. The castle smelled different now. Not of death or smoke, but of bread, hay, and damp stone. The windows no longer glowed with frost, only with light. Lady Isolde began to open the shutters each morning to let the sun in. She ordered the tapestries cleaned, the floors scrubbed. She walked the corridors in silence, touching the walls as if to thank them for standing strong. In the kitchens, laughter returned. A young girl sang as she kneaded dough, her voice rising softly above the hum of life. Even the rats seemed bolder now, scurrying out in the open as if to remind everyone that the world, in all its strange and stubborn ways, continued. One evening, Tomas went out to the edge of the forest. The trees stood dripping, their branches bare but glistening with meltwater. In the distance, he heard the faint croak of a frog, the first he had heard in half a year. He crouched by the frozen pond and touched the surface. It was thin now, fragile. When he pressed his palm down, it cracked gently, and dark water welled up beneath it. He smiled. He didn't know why, only that it felt like a promise. Back in the castle, Lord Alaric began repairs. Men hauled stones to mend the outer walls. Carpenters patched the roof where the ice had torn it open. The smith's forge roared again, sparks flying into the open air. The sound of hammer on iron echoed through the courtyard like a heartbeat, the rhythm of life returning. And in the great hall, Tomas kept the fire burning. Always. Even when the sun shone bright and the air turned warm again, he lit the hearth every morning. Because he knew now what that flame meant. It was not just warmth. It was memory. That spring, travelers returned to the roads. Messengers brought news from other castles, some that had survived, others that had fallen to famine and frost. But Dunmere had endured, and word of it spread across the shires. They said the old fortress had held its fire through the longest winter in living memory.